First of all, it's a pleasure to be at Jagiellonian. I have the privilege every summer of the last 10 years of teaching at Jagiellonian and teaching Polish teachers about the history of the Holocaust. And therefore, I feel very at home in this distinguished university. Having just survived the Passover Seder, my daughter, who did her doctoral thesis in part on the Haggadah, always used to joke that the Seder in our home takes a little bit longer than the Exodus, and that the fifth question is, when shall we eat? So I am standing between you and eating, so therefore I will have to be cautious and careful. I've been asked to address the question of the Holocaust in context. Let me put it in a couple of contexts for you very quickly. First of all, the Holocaust Scholarship is thriving in ways that we never imagined before. The Holocaust used to be a footnote to the study of World War II, and now it has taken center stage, and works appear in a variety of formats from a variety of perspectives in all sorts of ways, which shed brand new light on the Holocaust. Let me only touch on four very briefly. One is Tim Snyder's new work, The Black Earth. And Snyder takes a very bold stand that forces us to rethink a variety of things. The first is he asks the questions, why were the Jews targeted in Hitler's universe? And precisely speaks of Hitler as engaged in a world in which he saw the Jews as anti-natural because they restricted and restrained the exercise of might. And if we live in an extreme form of social Darwinism where it's survival of the fittest, the Jews, by virtue of their very basic morality and indirectly Christianity, which adopted that morality, had to be eliminated because they restrained by moral considerations the exercise of power. He focuses in a radically different way about the nature of Jews as a target, and sees it within a worldview that looks at Hitler aiming not only at Lebensraum, living space, but also space to live well, and for him that was power and domination. Snyder also does a very important thing which we have to consider, especially in this region of the world, which is he focuses on the role of statelessness. And that is that Jews were most vulnerable where not only, and this challenges some of the considerations here that have been offered, not only the role of law, but the problem was that in areas where there was no law, statelessness proved a unique vulnerability. And he shows that even the promise of the realization of statelessness, of state, became instrumental for the use of a series of forces to assist the German Einsatzgruppen in murder, and in areas such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the dramatic role and transformation in the killing process that was done by locals, and also the dramatic change that was done in the period when there was statelessness between Soviet and German occupation. Ironically, he suggests that we consider in a very interesting way that one of the strongest assertions of Jewish rights in this land, in Poland, was where the one area where the state did not disintegrate, and that was with the government of exile. And that is that we have to consider them as the only group within Poland willing to defend the Jews, because they still saw Jews as citizens of the state. That underscores also the question of the role of 1935 in depriving the Jews of the right of citizenship, which forces them into statelessness, and also, interestingly enough, underscores the natural inclination of Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when we learned the consequences of statelessness and powerlessness, to make one of the primary items of the agenda the achievement of a Jewish state and the achievement of adequate Jewish power to sustain that state and the like. Second example, which I want to touch upon are people going from different areas of inquiry. One of the most interesting books that has come out is a role called The Holocaust versus the Wehrmacht. It's written by a logistics expert, a military logistics expert, who looks at a very basic issue, which is how were the Germans going to supply their troops, looks most particularly at the attack on the Soviet Union, figures out how many trains were needed to bring 600,000 horses to the front, and to bring the food that was responsible for feeding 600,000 horses in the front, something I never thought of once in my life. Comes then to the broad conclusion that if Germany had really concentrated on winning the war, then the two times in which it had the greatest acts against the Jews, 1944 and 1942, were the two times that its own supply lines were most vulnerable, and the two times in which there was a battle and a struggle, which he then finds in documents, between the SS and the Wehrmacht over what was going to be the national priority. 1942 is clear because the basic way of looking at Wannsee is at the time of the Wannsee Conference, 80% of the Jews who were to be murdered during the Holocaust were alive. 16 months later, 80% of them were dead. 1944 is clear because, again, between the 15th of May and the 8th of July, 437,000 Jews were deported on 147 trains, destination primarily Auschwitz. And that was the period of time in which the Soviet Union was invading from the east the United States, and the Allies had begun D-Day. Hitler's supply lines were stretched to the extreme, and what Pachter shows with that, which is extraordinary, is the fact is that the war against the Jews took primacy, but now he can show it not as an ideological thing, but he can show it in documents, train by train, battle by battle. There's a new book, for example, on the relationship between Polish resistance and the Jews that now no longer goes into polemics, but goes into detail after detail about it. There's also a collection of very interesting documents that will soon be be published, which is a republication of the Polish underground press and what it reported about the Jews, so we will know precisely what happened in this land and when and what could have been known and what was revealed to the general population. Let me touch on one area that is of particular interest to me, which is a magnificent new book called It Kept Us Alive, on the role of humor in the Holocaust. And the role of humor in the Holocaust becomes important because it shows the capacity of human beings to confront their reality and live even in the shadow with the overwhelming shadow of death. And it gathers all of the ways in which Jews used humor, and then all of the instrumentalities in which life was celebrated amidst destruction. Shows you precisely the inner nature of what was happening within the community. Let me use the occasion to just tell part of the story. Three guys are sitting down and talking. One says, "Oi," the other says, "Oi, oi," and the other guy says, "Oi, oi, oi." So much for politics, gentlemen. Now let's talk about something else. A child is asked in the Warsaw Ghetto, "What would you like most of all?" And he said it in Yiddish, "Ich will sein a Yossam." I'd most of all like to be an orphan. And thus he uses his imagination very clearly to slaughter the one whom put him in the ghetto. Archives are going to open up. One of the very interesting archives that will soon have to open and one that we should use the incredible papacy of Pope Francis to open, is the Vatican archives, because the Vatican archives, we don't think of it, but the Vatican had the greatest intelligence network in all of Europe. Had all the people on the ground everywhere, had chaplains in each of the armies. You cannot reveal the content of confession, but you can reveal that which you learn by virtue of confession, not about the individual, but about the circumstances. And that will finally be able to answer for us, what did they know and when did they know it? And then what did they do with it? We have a wonderful book by Susan Zuccotti about a decade ago, who came to the radical conclusion by showing the letters that were sent to the Vatican, letters that came back from the Vatican, came to the radical conclusion that local Catholics did far better than the Roman Catholic Vatican and its hierarchy, and showed the degree to which they operated against instructions and without instructions to save out of humanitarian levels. One of the archives that will shortly open, I'm sorry the Minister of Justice is not here, is a very important archive which is going to tell us how the victims felt about each other at the very beginning of the early years after the Holocaust, and that is the trials that took place, the honor courts that took place in Israel, both pre-state and immediately after the state, dealing with Jewish behavior toward Jews. And that will provide us very interesting insights in what happened at the time and also what happens over time. We even discovered a very important document that I've known about for about 3 years, but Elie Wiesel had a Hebrew version of Night that is far more critical of God, far more critical of the Jews, than what he allowed to be published even in Argentina in Yiddish, and then what he allowed to be published in the United States in the 2 versions of Night. It's going to be essential for scholars in the future to understand Wiesel's, and you can read the Yiddish, the Hebrew, and the French side by side to understand Wiesel, what Wiesel really wanted to tell the Jews about his experience. And then the more he became a public figure, the more he was restrained in that. I'm sorry the Justice Minister is not here, because we can also answer directly. I mean, we wrote a book on this about the question why Auschwitz wasn't bombed, and if you want to deal with the non-bombing of Auschwitz, you have to deal with the very fact that as late as June 11th, 1944, David Ben-Gurion, meeting with the cabinet of the Jewish Agency, voted not to request bombing, and that July 7th, 1944, Chaim Weizmann and Moshe Chertok, meeting with Anthony Eden, requested that Auschwitz be bombed, got an approval from Winston Churchill, who said, do what you can, get anything you can out of the RAF, and invoke my name if necessary. And you have to ask the question then, presuming for a moment that Ben-Gurion is not an anti-Semite, you have to ask the question is, what is the difference between July 11th and June 11th and July 7th, 26 days? What is the difference between the one decision and the other? And the answer, in all probability, is the emergence of the Verba-Wexler report out of Slovakia, which gave a detailed manner of what was happening at Auschwitz, which leads us to the conclusion that in order to bomb Auschwitz, you had to have not information but knowledge, clear knowledge that was getting you to make the thing. You needed the capacity. The United States only had the capacity to bomb in the spring of 1944, when we could go 528 miles from Italy and come back. And finally, and most importantly, you had to have the commitment. And the best example of the lack of commitment was the statement by John J. McLoy, such an action, even if practicable, might provoke a more vindictive response on the part of Germans. There's considerable consideration to doing it, but it would require the diversion of significant resources now engaged in operations elsewhere and would be of dubious efficacy, that it would not warrant the use of such resources. So we know that. We know that from archives. We know that from studying and the like. Teaching is going in two directions. Teaching is going in a direction in which some people learn from the Holocaust that the world is against the Jews, not a lesson that is untrue and not a lesson that is not reinforced elsewhere. And others teach the very same experience for pluralism, tolerance, democracy, and mutual acceptance. We have learned how to teach with a sense of failure of the world, but the most important element, and this is a suggestion to Poland at a time of extreme nationalism, you can learn from your failures if you begin to understand what the nature of repair that is required in the future. And if your last word is failure, it leaves you to impotence. If your last word is repair, it empowers you to transform it in a variety of different ways. We've learned positive models. We've learned the upstander. I don't use the term righteous among the nations because I don't think my students aspire to be righteous. I think they do aspire to the word that was used before. They aspire to be mentioned. They aspire to be decent human beings. If we put them righteous, we put them out of reach. If we speak about the courage to do something, to stand up and the like, the courage to be a human being in a world that lacks them, then we can give them something that they can understand and aspire to, emulate and act upon. And we've also understood the role of messenger. And the role of messenger is not a one-time thing. I taught with Jan Karski. I preached at his funeral. I even said Kaddish as he was buried with a Jewish star on his lapel, and Karski spoke 226 times in 1944 and 1945 to tell the world what was happening. He spoke, we did not listen, and unfortunately, one goes through the world today with a sense of déjà vu all over again. We have a problem to our teaching, which is our students see it happening, not never again, but again. And to use Professor Cutler's remarks, again, again, and again. They also see a world in which anti-Semitism has taken on different forms, but it's a world in which anti-Semitism has to be seen in the context of all sorts of permissibility for the expression of hatred, where we lived in a world in my generation where there was restraint on the expression of hatred. There was less anti-Semitism, there is less anti-Semitism now, at least in the United States, on demographic information than there was when I was growing up, but there was a restraint on the expression of anti-Semitism, which led us to believe that there was left. We live in a world in which there's a combination of Holocaust fatigue, we know it all, we've seen it all, versus extraordinary interest in the Holocaust. I want to point out for those in problem about denial, is that denial is the self-defeat of David Irving. And I'm very meticulous in this. Deborah Irving was a classmate of mine, is a friend of mine. Her victory was unimportant. The defeat of David Irving was all important. It's now going to be made a movie, and it's going to have the capacity to influence millions of people. We also see the power that when you focus on an event, we see the power of its capacity. Again, Holocaust fatigue, you can't get a bloody Holocaust film made, but I know of about 20 that are in process. The Son of Saul won an Academy Award. We're also going to have a film on Ringelblum and on the nature of how you write a history from the inside. And we're also going to have a new film, we just finished a film on the last survivor of Treblinka that's going to be broadcast tonight on PBS. When we started, we had 5 survivors of Treblinka. We finished the film, and the last survivor of Treblinka died within 3 months of that. Finally, let me conclude by saying, we need to pursue the truth, and we need to pursue the truth in such a way that we can accept responsibility for where the truth takes us. We cannot undo the past, but we can transform the future. And the Holocaust, unfortunately, touches some of the largest issues that are contemporary to our society. There is no more important issue to the future of our collective humanity than whether, for example, a religion can adhere to its own principles with passion and with fundamentalism, with intensity and total commitment, and yet make room in the world for a religion with a view that differs. We have a wonderful example of a religion that did transform its teaching to make room for that in Roman Catholicism. The role of John the 23rd in undoing the charge of deicide, and even last month, the incredible statement by the Roman Catholic Church which says that there is no need to convert the Jews because the covenant and the original covenant between God and Israel remains in effect. Holocaust has transformed our legal situation. You're going to talk about it. It's transformed medical ethics. Let me give you one example of legal. I had the opportunity to be the executive editor of the second Encyclopedia Judaica. We looked at the legal consideration of the first Encyclopedia Judaica, and we had to throw out virtually all of the essays, because all of the essays were trying to tell us the degree to which the Nazis violated the codes of law. The new approach was to say, how was the instrumentality of law used to identify, segregate, isolate, de-citizenize, and ultimately murder the people? And we also have the question of religious ethics, of medical ethics, and also the question of governmental ethics, because the people who perpetrated the Holocaust were government officials, but also the people who fought the Holocaust were government officials. We've heard the example of Wallenberg. You can use the example of de Sousa Mendes, who essentially paid for with his career for the work that he did in admitting people into Portugal. We can look at the heroic work of John Pele, Josiah Du Bois, and Randolph Paul. Last point at all, I wish that our field were irrelevant. The scandal of our world, the tragedy of our world is that unfortunately we are relevant. Thank you.